Full disclosure, I have never seen any of Game of Thrones. House of the Dragon is a prequel series that functions perfectly fine as an independent show, and my perspective will be one liberated from the inevitable comparisons drawn between the two shows by most. We'll be talking about how this first season is written, structured, and executed, not from a fan's perspective who wants to see it live up to the Game of Thrones name, but to see if it functions as a good show upon its own merit that wins over a newcomer. My top level answer is yes. House of the Dragon is a good fantasy drama that earned my attention very early on and kept me engaged. Let's dive into the script breakdown. Chapter 1. Story. This is a political drama about how the Targaryen line needs to hold the Iron Throne to unite the 7 kingdoms and hold them through the winter storm prophesied by the Song of Ice and Fire. The through line of this first season is that the king and proprietor of the Iron Throne, Viserys, is dying and must choose his heir. He is of the Targaryen bloodline and it's his responsibility to keep one of his own blood in the chair, lest he betray the prophecy and in turn doom the kingdom to the winter storm's fate. But the inciting incident of the story makes that matter a whole lot more complicated when his wife and son die in childbirth, leaving only his daughter, Rhaenyra. This fantasy world mirrors a lot of medieval historical context about class and societal ranking, so it becomes quickly apparent that it would be unheard of for a woman to rule the kingdom. That conflict is what the majority of the show circles around. From my loose understanding, Game of Thrones previously squabbled the storyline around the prophecy, making it ultimately amount to nothing. All of these themes fell flat. One of my biggest questions about the longevity of House of the Dragon is this actually going to advance into the same territory and attempt to fix the ending that Game of Thrones swung at? If they do not find resolution through the fulfillment of the prophecy, then the conclusion of the show must be banked in the character's journey to secure the throne and set up a platform for the kingdom to find success in. Now, I think that the show has the right shoes on its feet, because whether or not we get the dramatic payoff of this prophecy in this show, it understands that regardless of that, everything must be planted in rich character arcs and conflict. Chapter 2. Characters. In the first 2 episodes of the show, it establishes a cast of characters very reminiscent of the Hamlet model. The king, who is clearly going to be phased out. The uncle, who is thirsty for the throne. The young child of the king, unfit to rule without growing first, who is given favor over the uncle. The board of advisors, etc. Being a newcomer, I really enjoyed that decision because it helped me avoid getting overwhelmed from a starting point. A vital thing to point out, though, is that by episode 3, these characters break away from those archetypes to form their own identity, and it was a really natural progression that I appreciated. Having strong character arcs is very important to me in both films and television. What I'm looking for is a strong inciting incident that thrust the protagonist into a completely new world in the first episode. An event that will give them a new identity in the first episode alone, and then we explore that new character throughout the entirety of the first season and bring their arc to a point of resolution/accomplishment. In the first episode, Rhaenyra is coronated as the heir to the throne after the death of her mother and brother. This is something she never thought would happen, but here we are. The rest of the season is about her proving her political ability, learning how to honor the traditions of the Targaryens, and trying to actually hold up her upcoming position as many parties are interested in undermining her. The show is based around 2 characters primarily. This young heir, Rhaenyra, and her childhood friend, Alicent, who is forced to marry Rhaenyra's father, the king, after the death of his wife. Choosing to have the 2 protagonists be females I think was a good choice because they're seen as less capable and untrustworthy. Putting them in the places of power breeds natural consequences and a lot of deception and tension to stir between the characters. This shows the harsh realities of being a lady in those times in pretty compelling ways that benefit the core of the story. Turning Alicent into effectively the mother of Rhaenyra ruins their friendship, of course, and the show focuses on that divide between them. Alicent is forced to do many things she never would have wanted to in the name of sacrifice for the futurement of her kingdom. Rhaenyra, though, has a free spirit and constantly pushes back against the notions of marriage, political responsibilities she doesn't like, etc. The philosophical conflict between Rhaenyra and Alicent is super compelling to me. It reminds me of the movie The Favorite, where it gets you to primarily empathize with Rhaenyra, the one basing her actions off emotions, but in reality, Alicent is the one who has the matters of the throne in mind, and she sacrifices the most. Everyone I've seen online hates Alicent because she is perceived and presented as a cold individual as she progresses, but I actually really like the dynamic that she brings to the table, and in the end, I could see her character being the tragic hero who loses, but was in the right, and we don't realize that until it's too late and Rhaenyra wins. Not her entire council is good. Her father, Otto, is really deceptive, but she has good intentions at the core of her decisions, despite mistakes she makes along the way. Chapter 3. Structure. This is a personal taste thing, but I really hate filler content. I'm generally way more into movies than I am television shows just because a story is self-contained within a film, or most of the time at least, whereas TV shows are such a mystery card and I can find them to be way too drug out sometimes. That being the case, one thing I really appreciate about House of the Dragon is that each episode has a pretty distinct identity and a very clear, major advancement in the story. Many have talked about how House of the Dragon is too slow, but I wouldn't say that actually. It's very methodical, but I think there are still things happening in each episode, which is much more than I can say about some. For me, this is what a slow show should be like. Let's break it down. If you don't want spoilers about what happens in each episode, skip to this point in the video. These will be very broad strokes though, and there will still be much of the show to discover even after I recount these events. Episode 1. The king loses his wife and child and chooses a successor in Rhaenyra. Daemon's thirst for the throne and warfare abilities are established. We build the friendship between Alicent and Rhaenyra. The death of the king's wife and son is a super strong inciting incident. Rhaenyra has a whole arc in this first episode, ending up somewhere completely different than when she started, and then we set up all these side characters and their placements in the world. Episode 2. Rhaenyra proves her political ability to the council, a clear advancement on the new world Rhaenyra has been placed in. She has a lot to prove and she gets straight to it in this episode. Daemon establishes his childlike misbehavior. Episode 3. Daemon, in turn, proves his own ability after being put through unfair situations. He proves he is better than the king at political warfare. He proves he deserves the throne in that respect. Meanwhile, Rhaenyra pushes back against the notion of marrying, but she comes to terms with it throughout the episode. The king tells her that she can choose her own husband as long as she actually marries, and this is a very generous offer and one that Alicent never had. In this episode, Alicent is forced to marry the king. Episode 4. Tension builds between the free-spirited Rhaenyra and the sacrificial Alicent. Daemon convinces Rhaenyra that she doesn't need to be approved of to rule. He gets involved with her sexually to build an alliance. Her interest in being free from rules and tradition is highlighted in this episode as she discovers her sexuality and breaks away from the laws of royal conduct. This starts the reveal of Rhaenyra's illegitimacy to rule and breaks trust between she and Alicent. The king hears rumors of her actions and puts his foot down, telling her that she will marry Laenor, a prince from another kingdom, even though she was previously given liberty on the matter. Otto, Alicent's father, is fired from the council of the king for being deceitful. Episode 5. Rhaenyra and Laenor marry under the agreement that they will follow their own interests and live separate lives in secret. This shows their abandonment of royal duties. Alicent finds proof of Rhaenyra's shenanigans and distrusts her completely now. At the wedding, Alicent wears a green dress, the color of war. Tension boils and blood is spilled at the wedding, signaling civil war. The first half of the season has set the stage for all the conflict at play, and now we advance. Episode 6. There are some major time jumps in the show to the point that in this episode, the actors of Alicent and Rhaenyra are replaced by adults. Time jumps are usually a pretty hard thing to sell to me, and I know that it's been a point of discourse in the community around this show, but it actually works pretty well for me here. It feels earned to me because the thrust of this season is about the escalating sickness of the king until he finally dies, so it makes sense to follow along with that at a rapid pace rather than draw everything out for no reason. The actors sell it really well, and I found myself readjusted very quickly. It would make sense to me if the show keeps using time jumps too, since it's following the Targaryen line up to the Song of Ice and Fire. This episode takes place about 10 years later, and both Alicent and Rhaenyra are mothers now. It becomes evident that Rhaenyra's child is illegitimate because she is not having children with Laenor, but a secret interest. Tension between the children rises already. Hierarchies are formed from a young age. Alicent refuses to side with Rhaenyra, and Alicent makes a plan with Otto to get him back into the Council of the King, and they succeed. Episode 7. The children hurt one another in a quarrel, and it becomes public that Rhaenyra's children are illegitimate. Knives come out and blood spills. The only thing that stops the mothers from going into full warfare is the king. He calms everyone down, but it's clear that they all patiently prime their plans with anticipation of his death. As the episode ends, Daemon and Rhaenyra take Laenor out of the picture so they can marry and have a family together. Episode 8. At a royal gathering, Daemon beheads those who condemn their children as illegitimate. The king dies in this episode. In his final moments, he thinks he's talking to Rhaenyra, but this is actually Alicent present. He reminds her to follow Aegon Targaryen's line, and Alicent mistakes this to mean that he wants her son, of the same name, to succeed him instead of Rhaenyra. In reality, this was just him telling Rhaenyra to stay true to holding the Targaryen line upon the Iron Throne to prepare for the Song of Ice and Fire. Episode 9. Alicent moves forward with plans to crown Aegon following her husband's death. Otto, her father, reveals that they already had plans to do this behind her back, and he kills a council member who's disgusted by these plans out of loyalty to the line. Alicent and the council imprison those who disagree with their plan, and they crown Aegon king. One of the characters who disagree with this plan escapes on Dragonback to tell Rhaenyra and Daemon of the news. Episode 10, the finale. Rhaenyra and Daemon get the news of the king's passing and Aegon's crowning. Daemon is ready to go straight out to war, but Rhaenyra politics for most of the episode to try and go find peaceful solutions because she does not want to rule a kingdom burnt to the ground. While serving as a messenger, Rhaenyra's son is killed by Alicent's son during a dragonback fight. This sets the stage for an inevitable war that has just been launched. There is no coming back. Alright, so these are really good arcs in my opinion for a first season. The king slowly dies and crowns Rhaenyra his successor. She is discovered to be irresponsible with her duties to the prophecy, so Alicent undermines her and gets her own son crowned king instead. We go all the way from looking for a successor to having that plan undermined, which puts war in an inevitable position for season 2. In broad strokes especially, I really like this structure for a season because it caters to slowly escalating the tension between Rhaenyra and Alicent, and it puts very compelling arguments on both sides. I do wish at the end of the show they could have restructured it slightly to have the endnote be Aegon's crowning rather than the death of Rhaenyra's son. If we inverted those events, I think it would capitalize on the starting point of the show better. We start with the birth sequence looking for an heir. We end with the crowning of his successor. I think that would have been a stronger and more satisfying ending, but each of those steps were still present within this first season, so I'm happy about that. Not all of the moment-to-moment decisions completely work for me all the time. There are a lot of tiny logic decisions that left me scratching my head. The level at which I got attached to characters was kind of uneven. I think there are a few too many characters introduced near the end of the show to the point that it takes away from some of the emotional levity of the conclusion. I have some small complaints in those regards, but I really want us to focus on this structure. I want to look at the good instead of the bad. The end of the season should conclude what is set up at the beginning. This one arc should not be drug out over 5 seasons, and thankfully the show recognized that, and I think it's its greatest strength. Chapter 4. Conflict. That conflict between Alicent and Rhaenyra is the bread and butter of this show. Already we can see that since we established this conflict between them well, it's simply a breeding ground for the descendants to hate each other. And with each child that is born, the twisted web gets more and more complicated in a good way. Conflict is perhaps the most important element of storytelling to me because through the resolution of your conflict is where meaning in your story breeds. When I teach conflict, there are 3 forms of it that must be instilled into your story. Internal conflict. This is the relationship between Alicent and Rhaenyra. They have a childhood friendship, but Alicent feels betrayed by Rhaenyra because she never lives up to the same level of sacrifice that she had to go through for the kingdom. External conflict. The impending doom of the prophecy, this winter storm, is a very real external threat that causes political conflict between the kingdoms. We could boil this down to the concept of finding an heir. This is the conflict that everyone wants to resolve but are butting heads over. What is key to me in this process of clearly defining the conflict in your story is to define the beliefs of your characters. These characters butt heads because they believe different things. This internal and external conflict is inseparable now for Alicent and Rhaenyra. Through them fighting over who should be the successor, we get to explore their beliefs on why they disagree. Alicent believes in upholding the pure bloodline of the Targaryens, even though she doesn't understand why that is as important as it is through the extents of the prophecy. Her insistence on this matter is strengthened by a grudge because her best friend betrayed her by never owning up to the royal duty that she had to. She doesn't want to see Rhaenyra succeed off a sacrifice-free life. Rhaenyra, on the other hand, believes that she is owed the throne because that is what was promised to her. She earned it initially, but she does not hold true to the responsibility of the throne, and she is not heeding the warnings of the prophecy. What we have butting heads here is sacrificial duty and self-centered entitlement. By making the internal and external conflicts inseparable and fusing them deep with beliefs of your characters, that is what forms your philosophical conflict. This right here, sacrificial duty versus self-centered entitlement, is the philosophical conflict, and that is the talking point of this entire story thus far. While we're only looking at the first season, which is not the whole story, what we need to be looking for in the continuation is for us to eventually find a resolution between these two butting heads. One side must win. Now let's think about this. If you were writing this show, you as the artist would have your voice by letting a side win. When you resolve that conflict, you state your opinion on the philosophical, moral, or ethical conflict at hand. Which of these two arguments do you believe in or side with? That is the character that should win. Obviously, that's a little bit of a generalization of everything a story can be, but that is the concept of how to convey your opinion through a story. I mentioned earlier in the video that this conflict of beliefs reminds me of the film The Favorite, directed by Yorgos Lanthimos. If you're enjoying this show or find that conflict engaging, I would highly recommend watching that film. It's one of my favorite movies of all time, and I think that at this point in the story at least, it's a more polished and impactful exploration of this topic. That's not a jab at House of the Dragon though, because I think this is a really fundamentally solid but imperfect season of television, and I would recommend it. Thanks for watching this episode, guys. Next up, I'll be talking about the new film Tar, which just hit theaters in the States. That video will be up on Friday at 2 p.m. If you enjoyed the video or found it informative, consider liking and subscribing for more screenwriting content. If you thought the video could have been better though, leave it a thumbs down and give me some constructive criticisms in the comments below. Thanks guys, I'll see you later.